Hi, I think I'm speaking to you directly from that angle, so I'll look in that general direction. My name is Neel Jassani. I'm an artist, and I founded GUNK, which is sort of a media company that started out as a publication. So let us begin. Okay, how did this happen? I guess I started out as an artist for the longest time. So I was a fine painter. I delved in oil painting mainly, and at some point I just realized I was extremely bored. And I think as an artist, sometimes the system tells you that you're limited to the capacity of your own medium, and I don't think that's true. So this is a story of the distracted mind. I feel like for most creatives, we can be hyper-fixated on the general direction of where we're supposed to go, right? The path that, you learn in art school or whatever you're supposed to follow throughout that time. And I think most of us are
very distracted, or in other words, we just have a lot of creative energy pent up, and no specific direction to kind of exert that energy. So after the longest time, when I was just like painting, doing art exhibitions, I realized that, well, the thing is with painting is that you're supposed to be super serious, right? You're supposed to appeal to a certain demographic that could not particularly be into, the weird stuff. And I just decided one day that I was going to stop painting altogether, and I was going to hole myself up in a room for 12 hours a day, and just whatever creative idea that kind of spawns, I was just going to engage with it and see what happens. So that's when a bunch of experimentation started happening. So I started learning InDesign, which is when you start out, it's a bit of a challenge. And I just started putting all these images together. This one particular page was just a stupid idea I had. I was like, let me change this man, which is from a painting that I had a long time ago, into a vegetable. And then I was like, how could that be interesting? So I was thinking of like old Windows XP and that kind of design aspect. And then I was like, okay, what if it was like an internet game? And I just started having all these ideas that usually would have been, repressed. And, this doesn't fit into the fine art lens, right? So it was all bottled up inside. And then when I decided to release it, I just started having idea after idea. So I just started, frogs. Why not, right? Bunch of frogs that you can lick. Probably shouldn't, by the way. And then I was like, how could this be interesting, right? So I started putting in all these frogs. I researched them, and then I was like, okay, why is this relevant, right? Okay, so there's these poison levels, and what frog would you lick, right? Maybe that's shallow, or it's not particularly deep, but it was a creative idea. I was just like, let me go with it. And in the beginning, I wasn't really showing this to anyone, right? So this turned into a publication, but in the beginning, it was just idea after idea. It was a journal in a sense. And then I started looking deeper. So, right, Louis C.K. Is a great example to use here. He's a comedian, a brilliant one at that, and he was in a rut. Okay, so this is a great. I love telling the story, but he was a comedian and he would do all these bits at Chinese restaurants, and he was doing bit after bit at the same old Chinese restaurant where the audience is just kind of sitting there and having their lunch, not really expecting anything, there. And they were kind of irritated that he was doing these bits, and he'd get a couple chuckles here and there, but it wasn't fulfilling. He wasn't being interesting. And then one day he just left, and he was just in distress in his car, And the radio turned on, and George Carlin, another fantastic comedian, was talking about how he made comedy. And the way he did it is he would take do a bit, right? And it could start out shallow. So it could be about dogs or socks or whatever. Make that funny. And then once you finish doing that bit, then toss it and look deeper. Okay, so what's deeper than dogs, right? So maybe it's your feelings, or maybe it's what you do day to day. And then you finish that and you toss that, and then you go deeper, and then weird stuff comes out, right? Maybe it's personal trauma, maybe it's war crimes or whatever. Just like keep digging deeper and then see what you find. So that's kind of the method that I applied here when I started out, the frogs and the weird abstract stuff. And then I was like, okay, where can I go from here? And I started talking about my story, how I started out. So it started in my high school bedroom, a bunch of wall vandalizing that my parents were not very pleased with. And then, my first group show, which I didn't think much of at the time, but was kind of set me on into this path. And then my first solo with the Queen Elizabeth. So I wanted to, this isn't a very traditional way to, create a magazine, but it was never supposed to be anything more than, a private just delving into my deep subconscious and seeing what I'll find that's more interesting than the painting stuff. Because, sometimes you get bored and you want to go in a different direction, but you don't know where to start. Sometimes it's good not to look at the bigger picture and just start small. So after doing that for a while, right, still haven't shown this to anyone, I had a very interesting encounter. And this encounter was at the studio where I was working at. And this guy just kind of walks in, and never met this guy before, okay? And he just, we have small talk, whatever. And then he looks into what I've created so far. One of the first people to see my InDesign file that was a mess. And he just started critiquing it super hard out of nowhere. And I was like, this is a bit much for a stranger, but sometimes you have to be open to the universe and see what might happen, because you could be in your head, tunnel narrow tunnel vision in your laptop, and maybe you're showing it to a couple friends and everything, and they're like, this is super good, but you need an outside opinion. So this random stranger who was like butchering my work in front of me was actually great. And one of the biggest pieces of advice that he gave that I really took to heart was, how is this relevant beyond you, right? So far all I have are these random images, and I have, personal stories, but why is this relevant to anyone else, right? Who cares what my life is or what thoughts that pop into my head are? Which was really interesting. And he said a good way to, transcend outside the boundaries of your mind is to go and talk to people. What is happening around you, right? You're doing a publication, which I didn't really realize I was doing at the time. So I was like, okay, how do I do that? He's like, why don't you interview a bunch of people, you know? And at that point I was like, ah, I think I'm above this. Why would I interview people? I want to be interviewed, and I think once you get over the ego aspect, you can kind of figure some things out. So the first interview that I did was with a good friend of mine, Mason, who has a skateboarding company. And this is a super private guy, right? He didn't do a lot of interviews. He did one interview with Vice, and they completely butchered his story and kind of turned it into something else that wasn't authentic. And obviously I started with the hardest person to get, but it actually really worked out. I kind of just walked into his house one day and I said, I have an idea to talk to you about. And he was like, okay, sure. Can we call over this? And I was like, no, absolutely not. So I walk into his home and I kind of sit down, bit of small talk. And then I was like, hey, can I like interview you for this magazine that has no legitimate credentials whatsoever? And like, let's see what kind of happens. And he's like, probably not. But let's see where it goes. So we just start talking. I'm like, can I record? He's like, okay, that's a bit sus. And I'm just asking about his life. and it's genuine, right? I'm really curious about his story. This is him. That's his face. And I wanted to see how he started out the skateboarding company. Obviously, it's super important to him. That's why the story was important. And I really wanted to do it justice. And once we finished, he had one question for me that kind of was kind of the defining question of whether or not this was going to get published. And he said, "Why are you doing this?" And I think the answer was almost immediate because I was so in my head at the time that I knew why I was doing this. I was doing this to counter something, to counter a system that was set in place, to counter, what you're supposed to be as an artist. I was just like, I had all this rage and energy and I wanted to counter something. And he was like, "Yeah, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing." And then we were kind of bonded over that. And that's why this ended up in print. This is amazing, by the way. This was in Afghanistan where they kind of went on this skating trip and photographed all these like soldiers just skateboarding, which is super awesome. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. And then we launched. I didn't realize this day would come because, you're doing it alone for so long and you're, looking in InDesign for endless hours that you think you're going to lose your mind. So that was awesome that it ended up being published. The launch was amazing. We kind of had all kinds of creatives come in, creatives that were in the magazine and that weren't. And that is kind of how GUNK has evolved, right? Being in that space and seeing so many different creatives come together, talking, engaging with one another, and like kind of just looking at the magazine. The whole thing was surreal. And I loved that. And I didn't want it to just be behind screens anymore. I wanted to be out in the world. That's why I started doing so many pop-ups. That's why I started talking to so many different people. And I realized that, maybe there could be a physical identity to the magazine. And that's how World of Gunk kind of formed, right? So the company now is going to start launching skateboards. It's going to, have a fashion line. It's basically everything that you want to do as a creative that maybe you feel like, wait, why would I dip my toe into this? This isn't my medium. This isn't what I'm supposed to do, right? But why not? I feel like we're in an era of so much consumption, of so much media that you can basically take anything and run with it. I mean, people are doing it all the time. So that's what I decided to do. I kind of want to tap into all these different industries that, maybe are not my particular field, but I could talk to experts in the industry and see how it can evolve from there. And finally, there's volume 2, which will be released in April, I believe. So that's all very exciting. The second volume is kind of going to delve into more subcultures in the UAE. So there's so much happening around here that we don't even know about. There are gangs of bikers. There's bullfighting rings with Khaliji cowboys that are being run in different states. There's so many crazy stories out there, and you think that everything that's happening here is so shallow and it's not the case. There's people, there's cultures, there's things happening that we don't even know about, and that's kind of my hope for the second volume. We're also looking for writers and graphic designers, so if anybody is interested in writing or designing with us, do send us an email. So that's GUNK in a nutshell, and that's my story. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Neel, thank you for coming to present about that. Amazing inspiration for people who want to start their own publications. Will you be here tomorrow? Excellent. So anybody that would like to speak to Neel further about her project can talk to her in person tomorrow in the foyer. Okay, that's amazing. Thank you.